What if one legendary hunter had to face Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, and werewolves, all in a single battle, filled with epic action, dark secrets, and non stop monster fights? Van Helsing 2004 follows fearless hunter on his most dangerous mission to stop Dracula before it's too late. Welcome to Kako Film, where we bring you complete movie reviews, hidden facts, and everything you need to know about your favorite movies. Van Helsing 2004 assembled one of the most visually spectacular and genre savvy casts of the early 2000s action horror boom. Written and directed by Steven Sommers, the filmmaker whose reinvention of The Mummy 1999 had demonstrated that classic Universal monsters could be repackaged as crowd pleasing action adventure entertainment. The film stars Hugh Jackman as Gabriel Van Helsing, Kate Beckinsale as Anna Valerius, and Richard Roxburgh as Count Dracula. Joining them are David Wenham, Schuler Hensley, Kevin J. O'Connor, Will Kemp, Elena Anaya, Sylvia Coloca, Josie Maran, Alun Armstrong, Samuel West, and Robbie Coltrane. Universal Pictures wanted to reinvent their iconic movie monsters and wanted to replicate the formula that had worked for both The Mummy 1999 and The Mummy Returns 2001. Not only by bringing on Summers as the director, but with the release date of May 7, 2004, 5 years to the date after The Mummy opened. Below is a thorough examination of every significant casting decision in the film. Hugh Jackman as Gabriel Van Helsing. The casting of Hugh Jackman as Gabriel Van Helsing was the film's foundational commercial and creative decision, placing one of the most physically charismatic action stars of the era at the center of a franchise Universal hoped would rival The Mummy in commercial longevity. Jackman had been propelled to global stardom by his portrayal of Wolverine in the X-Men franchise beginning in 2000, and by 2004, he was one of the most bankable action performers in Hollywood. Summers reimagined Van Helsing from Bram Stoker's elderly Dutch professor into a young, physically formidable action hero, a Vatican sponsored monster hunter with amnesia about his own origins and a mysterious connection to Dracula himself. This radical reconception of the character required a performer who could credibly anchor an action franchise while also projecting the existential uncertainty of a man who does not fully understand his own identity or history. Jackman brought specific qualities to Van Helsing that distinguished his performance from his concurrent Wolverine work, where Wolverine was defined by feral rage and solitary intensity. Van Helsing was characterized by weary duty and dry wit, a professional monster hunter who approaches his work with competence rather than passion, and this whose emotional investment in the mission develops through his relationship with Anna rather than from personal vendetta. Jackman's natural warmth and his Australian capacity for self deprecating humor gave Van Helsing a lightness that Sommers' maximalist visual spectacle badly needed to remain entertaining rather than overwhelming. Alan Silvestri composed the film's original soundtrack, and Jackman also provided voice talent for the Van Helsing video game adaptation published by Vivendi Universal Games for PlayStation 2, Xbox, and Game Boy Advance. Jackman's willingness to extend his involvement to the video game tie in demonstrated his commitment to the franchise and the studio's confidence in his voice as the character's definitive identity across multiple platforms. Kate Beckinsale as Anna Valerius. Kate Beckinsale plays Anna Valerius, the last descendant of an ancient Romanian family sworn to destroy Dracula. Beckinsale, who had established her action credentials as Celine in Underworld 2003 just 1 year earlier, was one of the most in demand action fantasy heroines in Hollywood at the time of casting, and her involvement gave the film a female lead who could match Jackman's physical presence without being overshadowed by it. Beckinsale's Anna is a warrior whose entire identity is defined by the generational obligation to defeat Dracula, a burden she has carried since childhood and that has cost her family everything. The character's specific combination of fierce determination and genuine grief gave Beckinsale dramatic material that went beyond the purely physical demands of the action sequences. Her commitment to the character's emotional arcs, the gradual lowering of her defensive guard as she allows herself to trust Van Helsing, gave the romance a credibility that the screenplay's breathless pacing might otherwise have prevented. The Beckinsale Jackman pairing was one of the film's most discussed elements. Both performers brought genuine screen magnetism to their scenes together, and the contrast between Beckinsale's dark, intense European energy and Jackman's broader, more openly charismatic Australian presence created a dynamic that was simultaneously romantic and combative. Partners whose attraction was expressed through competitive banter and shared danger rather than conventional courtship. Richard Roxburgh as Count Vladislaus Dracula. Richard Roxburgh plays Count Vladislaus Dracula, the film's primary antagonist and one of Universal's most iconic monster characters. Group. Roxburgh, the distinguished Australian actor whose career encompassed the Duke in Moulin Rouge 2001 and subsequent work as Moriarty in the Guy Ritchie Sherlock Holmes films brought a specific quality of theatrical flamboyance to the vampire count that gave the character genuine entertainment value. Blanchett Roxburgh said he loved the old Universal monster films, Klaus Kinski's Nosferatu and Gary Oldman's Dracula, and in general likes the dark, sad, kind of naive Germanic type of monster movie. About his physical transformation for the role, Roxburgh said that it's a pretty significant physical transformation. There is obviously darker hair, and I wanted a sense of a Romani king or leader, a faded aristocrat. I like that gypsy element, so the character looks nothing like me. Roxburgh's specific creative references, Kinski's feral, rat-like Nosferatu alongside Oldman's operatic romantic Dracula illuminate the particular version of the vampire he was constructing. His Dracula is not merely a monster but a Romani king and faded aristocrat whose centuries of existence have given him both weary sophistication and an absolute conviction of his own superiority. The decision to incorporate Romani cultural elements into the character's visual identity gave Dracula a specificity of cultural context that connected him to the Transylvanian setting more organically than a generic aristocratic vampire would have. Carl David Venom plays Carl, a friar and weapons inventor at the Vatican, who accompanies Van Helsing on his mission to Transylvania. Venom, the Australian actor whose career included the Lord of the Rings trilogy as Faramir and Moulin Rouge, alongside Roxburgh, brought a specific quality of nervous, intellectual energy to the film's comic relief role. Carl is a character defined by the gap between his intellectual brilliance and his physical timidity, a weapons designer who creates extraordinary devices but is terrified of the situations in which they must be used. Venom's natural gift for playing characters whose intelligence is accompanied by social awkwardness and physical anxiety made Carl one of the film's most reliably entertaining figures. His dynamic with Jackman's Van Helsing, the fearless warrior paired with the fearful inventor, was a classic action comedy partnership that gave the film's Transylvanian sequences their most consistent comic energy. Venom's involvement alongside Roxburgh gave the film an unusual concentration of Australian talent in European character roles, two graduates of the Australian theatre and film tradition playing, respectively, a Vatican friar and the Count of Transylvania. The shared theatrical background of both performers gave their scenes together a quality of collaborative ease that enhanced the film's entertainment value. Schuler Hensley as Frankenstein's monster. Schuler Hensley plays Frankenstein monster, the misunderstood creation who becomes an unlikely ally of Van Helsing. Hensley's casting was one of the production's most inspired creative decisions. He was not a film actor by background, but a Tony Award winning Broadway performer whose award for Oklahoma 2002 had demonstrated his ability to transform himself physically and vocally for a role. Hensley's monster draws on the tradition established by Boris Karloff in the 1931 original, a creature of genuine pathos whose monstrous appearance conceals a sensitive, frightened being. The character's function in the plot, he possesses information that Dracula needs and that Van Helsing must protect, gave him a narrative importance that elevated him beyond a mere cameo appearance. And Hensley's theatrical training gave the monster a quality of articulate suffering that made his scenes genuinely moving within the film's otherwise relentless action framework. The Brides of Dracula, Sylvia Coloca, Alena Anaya and Josie Miranda casting of Dracula's Three Brides was one of the film's most visually impactful decisions. Sylvia Coloca plays Verona, Alena Anaya plays Alera, and Josie Maran plays Marishka, three vampiric consorts whose aerial attack sequences became some of the film's most memorable action set pieces. Each bride was given a distinct visual identity and fighting personality. Coloca's Verona, the eldest and most authoritative, carried the regal bearing of Dracula's primary consort. Anaya's Alera, whose subsequent career would include acclaimed work in Pedro Almodovar's The Skin I Live in 2011, brought a feral, predatory energy to the most aggressive of the three brides. Maran's Marishka, the youngest and most playful, gave the trio its most seductive member, a character whose beauty is weaponized as effectively as her fangs. Sylvia Coloca and director Summers developed a romantic relationship during the production, and they subsequently married. This real life connection between actress and director gave the production a personal dimension that extended beyond the professional collaboration. Kevin J. O'Connor as Igor Kevin J. O'Connor plays Igor, Frankenstein's former servant, now working for Dracula. O'Connor, who had played Benny in Somers's The Mummy, was essentially reprising his function as the director's preferred weaselly, self-serving supporting villain. His ego is a creature of pure self interest, shifting his loyalty to whoever currently holds the most power, and O'Connor's natural gift for playing characters whose survival instinct overrides every moral consideration made Igor both contemptible and strangely entertaining. The O'Connor Summers connection was itself a piece of franchise continuity, the director bringing a performer he trusted into a new production because their previous collaboration had demonstrated a specific creative compatibility. Will Kemp as Velkan. Valerius Wilkemp plays Velkan and his brother, who is transformed into a werewolf early in the film. Kemp, British actor and dancer whose Royal Ballet training gave him extraordinary physical control, brought a specific quality of athletic grace to the character's human form that made his werewolf transformation more dramatically impactful. The contrast between Velkan's cultivated nobility and the bestial ferocity of his werewolf form was enhanced by Kemp's ability to communicate physical refinement before its destruction. Alun Armstrong as Cardinal Ginette. Alun Armstrong plays Cardinal Ginette, Van Helsing's superior at the Vatican, who dispatches him on the Transylvania mission. Armstrong, Armstrong, the distinguished British character actor whose career encompasses decades of stage and screen work, including Braveheart and Patriot Games, brought institutional gravitas to the brief but structurally essential role that establishes the film's Vatican headquartered mythology. His authority gave the audience understanding of Van Helsing's institutional context, a credibility that the film's rapid pacing could not otherwise have established. Samuel West as Dr. Victor Frankenstein and Stephen Fisher as Dr. Jekyll. Samuel West plays Dr. Victor Frankenstein in the film's black and white prologue sequence, a direct homage to James Whale's 1931 Frankenstein that establishes the monster's creation and Dracula's connection to the scientist. West, the British actor known for his distinguished stage career and his work in Howard's End, brought an appropriately heightened theatrical quality to the brief but atmospherically critical prologue. Stephen Fisher plays Dr. Henry Jekyll in the film's Paris set opening action sequence, which depicts Van Helsing's confrontation with Jekyll's monstrous alter ego, Mr. Hyde. Fisher's Jekyll is the film's first human antagonist. The scientist whose transformation into Hyde gives the opening sequence its monster hunting while establishing Van Helsing's professional methods and physical capabilities. Robbie Coltrane as Mr. Hyde. Voice. Robbie Coltrane provides the voice of Mr. Hyde, the enormous digitally rendered monster who battles Van Helsing atop Notre Dame Cathedral in the film's spectacular opening sequence. Coltrane, the Scottish actor beloved worldwide as Hagrid in the Harry Potter franchise, brought his naturally deep, commanding voice to a CGI creation that needed vocal presence to match its enormous physical scale. The combination of Coltrane's distinctive vocal quality and the visual effects team's imposing character design made Hyde one of the film's most memorable monsters despite appearing in only a single sequence. The ensemble as a whole taken together, the casting of Van Helsing reflects Stephen Sommers' specific philosophy of franchise entertainment, populating a visually spectacular action adventure with performers whose genuine dramatic credentials and natural charisma could sustain audience engagement across a film whose relentless pacing and maximalist visual effects left little room for conventional character development. Despite inconsistent CGI, some weak performances, and some dumb decisions, Van Helsing is still a fun and enjoyable fantasy adventure. Hugh Jackman gives a great lead performance, and Kate Beckinsale, Richard Roxburgh, and David Wenham are all really good. The film's ensemble, anchored by Jackman's charismatic authority, Beckinsale's fierce determination, Roxburgh's theatrical villainy, and Venom's intellectual comedy, gave Universal's Monster Universe revival its most commercially potent cast. The film grossed $300 million worldwide, establishing the ensemble's collective star power, even as the critical reception suggested that no cast, however talented, could fully compensate for the screenplay's narrative limitations. Universal was confident that Van Helsing would be a hit at the box office, and they began development on a sequel before the first film opened. Though plans for both the sequel and a television series titled Transylvania were ultimately abandoned when the film's reception fell short of franchise sustaining enthusiasm. The cast's lasting contribution to genre cinema lies not in the franchise that never materialized, but in the specific quality of committed, self aware performance they brought to material that demanded everything and promised nothing beyond the moment. Jackman, Beckinsale, Roxburgh, Wenham, and their colleagues gave Van Helsing the human energy that its digital spectacle needed to feel alive, and their collective effort remains the film's most enduring asset more than 2 decades after its release. Production development. Universal's monster revival strategy, a single filmmaker's creative vision, did drive not the development of Van Helsing but by a studio's institutional ambition to reinvent its most valuable legacy properties for a new generation of audiences. Universal Pictures wanted to reinvent their iconic movie monsters and wanted to replicate the formula that had worked for both The Mummy 1999 and The Mummy Returns 2001. This was not only attempted by bringing on Stephen Sommers as the director, but also with the release date of May 7th, 2004, which was 5 years to the date after The Mummy opened in 1999. The Mummy took the classic monster in an action adventure tone, so it made sense to do the same with Van Helsing. The strategic logic was clear and deliberate. Universal owned the most recognizable monster characters in cinema history: Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, the Wolfman, the Mummy, the Invisible Man, and the success of Somers's Mummy films had demonstrated that these characters could be repackaged as crowd pleasing action adventure entertainment for contemporary audiences. Van Helsing was designed from inception as the next phase of that strategy, using the character of Abraham Van Helsing, Dracula's nemesis in Bram Stoker's novel, as the connective tissue that would bring multiple monsters into a single franchise framework. While The Mummy was much inspired by Indiana Jones, Van Helsing drew heavily from James Bond films. This creative reference point, Bond rather than Jones, is illuminating about the specific registers Sommers was pursuing. Where Indiana Jones is defined by his vulnerability, his improvisation, and his scholarly incompetence at action, his professional competence, his institutional backing, and his access to specialized equipment defines James Bond. Van Helsing as Bond rather than Jones meant a protagonist who was a professional monster hunter with Vatican sponsorship and cutting edge weapons, not an accidental hero who stumbles into danger. The director writer Stephen Sommers wrote and directed the film, bringing the same combination of visual maximalism and genre enthusiasm that had made his mummy films commercially successful. His personal affinity for Universal's classic monster films, the Boris Karloff Frankenstein, the Bela Lugosi Dracula, the Lon Chaney Jr. Wolfman, gave the project a foundation of genuine genre love that manifested in the film's extensive visual and narrative references to those originals. The black and white prologue depicting Dr. Frankenstein's creation of the monster in a sequence that directly evokes James Whale's 1931 Frankenstein was Somers's most explicit love letter to the source material, establishing the film's relationship to its universal heritage before transitioning into the full color CGI enhanced action adventure that would define the rest of the runtime. The prologue's visual language, the expressionistic shadows, the angry villagers with torches, the windmill against the stormy sky, was so faithful to the 1930s originals that it functioned as both homage and artistic statement. This film knows where it comes from. Pre production, casting, and character reimagination. The casting process reimagined the Van Helsing character from Bram Stoker's elderly Dutch professor into a young, physically formidable action hero, Gabriel Van Helsing, a Vatican sponsored monster hunter with mysterious origins and lost memories. Hugh Jackman, fresh from his Wolverine breakthrough in the X-Men franchise, was cast as the titular character, bringing the specific combination of physical charisma, action credibility, and natural likability that the reinvented character demanded. Kate Beckinsale was cast as Anna Valerius, the last descendant of an ancient Romanian family sworn to destroy Dracula. Beckinsale's recent work in Underworld 2003, another action horror franchise featuring a physically capable female protagonist, had established her as one of the era's most in demand action fantasy heroines, and her involvement gave Van Helsing a female lead who could match Jackman's physicality without being reduced to a damsel role. Richard Roxburgh was cast as Count Dracula. Roxburgh said that he loved the old Universal monster films, Klaus Kinski's Nosferatu and Gary Oldman's Dracula, and in general likes the dark, sad, kind of naive, Germanic type of monster movie. About his physical transformation for the role, Roxburgh said that it's a pretty significant physical transformation. There is obviously darker hair, and I wanted a sense of a Romani king or leader, a faded aristocrat. I like that gypsy element, so the character looks nothing like me. David Wenham was cast as Carl, the Vatican friar and weapons inventor. Schuller Hensley, the Tony Award winning Broadway performer, was cast as Frankenstein's monster. Kevin J. O'Connor, who had played Benny in Somers' The Mummy, was cast as Igor. Will Kemp was cast as Vulcan Valerius. Sylvia Coloca, Elena Anaya, and Josie Maran were cast as Dracula's three brides. Alun Armstrong was cast as Cardinal Ginette. Samuel West was cast as Dr. Victor Frankenstein. Stephen Fisher was cast as Dr. Jekyll, and Robbie Coltrane provided the voice of Mr. Hyde. Budget and production scale. The film's budget of $160, 170 million made it one of the most expensive productions of 2004, a substantial investment that reflected Universal's confidence in the franchise potential and the enormous visual effects requirements of a film featuring multiple CGI monsters, extensive environmental destruction, and the elaborate practical and digital creature work needed to bring Dracula, the werewolves, the brides, Mr. Hyde, and Frankenstein's monster to convincing life on screen. Filming principal photography. Czech Republic. The filming took place primarily in the Czech Republic, using the country's established film production infrastructure and its atmospheric Central European landscapes as the backdrop for the film's Transylvanian and European settings. The Czech Republic's film tax incentive program and its relatively lower production costs compared to Western European or American locations made it an economically rational choice for a production of this scale. The production employed Alan Daviau as cinematographer, the five-time Oscar-nominated director of photography, whose credits included E.T. the Extraterrestrial, The Color Purple, and Empire of the Sun. Daviau's involvement brought a level of visual distinction to the production that exceeded what many action-adventure films of the era attempted. Being his expertise in atmospheric lighting, the ability to create visual environments that communicated mood and emotion through light alone was specifically relevant to a film whose aesthetic drew on the expressionistic tradition of the 1930s Universal horror films. The production design required the construction of extensive practical sets representing the film's various locations: Dracula's castle, Anna's ancestral home, the Vatican headquarters, the village in Transylvania, and the various interiors where the film's dramatic and action sequences unfold. The Transylvanian village set was substantial enough that Universal paid to maintain the structures after filming concluded, anticipating that they would be needed for a planned television series and potential sequel. Bob Duxey served as both producer and editor, a dual role that gave him unusual creative control over the film's construction from production through post production. Skelly Matsumoto served as co editor. Post production visual effects ILM and the CGI challenge. The post production visual effects work on Van Helsing was one of the most extensive of the 2004 theatrical season. The film's multiple monster characters Mr. Hyde, the werewolves, Dracula's flying brides, Dracula's demonic form, and Frankenstein's undead children each required distinct visual effects approaches and represented different technical challenges. The werewolf transformation sequences, in which Will Kemp's Velkan and later Hugh Jackman's Van Helsing transformed from human to lupine form, were among the most ambitious creature transformation effects attempted at that point in CGI history. The decision to render the werewolves as fully digital creatures rather than using practical prosthetics gave the transformation sequences a fluidity that practical effects could not have achieved, but also exposed the CGI to the scrutiny that would become one of the film's most criticized aspects. The Brides of Dracula, three vampiric figures who transform between human and monstrous bat like forms in flight, required effects work that combined digital creature animation with wire assisted practical performance. The aerial sequences in which the brides attack the Transylvanian village were among the film's most technically complex set pieces, requiring the integration of digital creatures, practical explosions, stunt performer wire work, and environmental effects within single continuous shots. Scott Squires, Ben Snow, Daniel Jennett, and Sid Dutton received a Saturn Award nomination for Best Special Effects for their work on the film, and the Visual Effects Society nominated Jeff Heron and Chad Taylor for Outstanding Special Effects in Service to Visual Effects in a Motion Picture. Music Alan Silvestri and the score the film's original soundtrack was composed by Alan Silvestri, who brought his extensive experience in action adventure scoring developed across Back to the Future, Predator, Forrest Gump, and dozens of other major productions to a film whose visual and narrative ambitions demanded equally large scale musical treatment. Silvestri's score won the Saturn Award for Best Music at the 31st Saturn Awards, the production's only major award win, and a recognition that the musical component of the film had achieved a quality that the critical reception of the film as a whole did not reflect. The Saturn Award victory acknowledged Silvestri's ability to create a score that was simultaneously orchestrally ambitious, thematically coherent, and emotionally effective within a film whose other elements received considerably less positive assessment. The score's challenge was to create distinct musical identities for the film's numerous monsters while maintaining the driving action energy that Sommers' maximalist visual style demanded. Each monster, Dracula, the werewolves, Mr. Hyde, Frankenstein's monster, needed its own thematic material, and the score's ability to shift between these identities while sustaining forward momentum across the film's 131-minute runtime was its primary compositional achievement. Release theatrical release, the film earned $51 million at one during the opening weekend of May 7 to 9, 2004. The $51 million opening, the number one film in the country on its debut weekend, was a commercially solid result that appeared to validate Universal's franchise ambitions. The opening was comparable to the $43 million debut of The Mummy Returns, adjusted for intervening inflation, and suggested an audience receptive to the kind of monster mashup entertainment that Sommers was offering. The film eventually grossed $120 million in North America and $180 million internationally for a worldwide total of $300 million. However, the worldwide total of $300 million against $160, $170 million budget before marketing costs was commercially disappointing by the standards Universal had set for the franchise. The comparison to The Mummy's $415 million worldwide and The Mummy Returns $433 million demonstrated that the Monster Hunter franchise had not achieved the commercial escalation that the studio's investment demanded. The franchise that never was Universal Pictures was confident that Van Helsing would be a hit at the box office, and they began development on a sequel before the first film opened. They even paid to keep the original Transylvania sets as they figured they would need to come back for it and other projects. Due to the film's disappointing box office performance, plans for the sequel were scrapped in April 2004, a month before Van Helsing opened in theaters. Universal Pictures announced a television series titled Transylvania. The plan was to use the set from the original film, and Universal Pictures paid to maintain the structures so that they could return to film there. And the series was planned to premiere on NBC in the fall of 2004. Just 2 weeks into Van Helsing's release, the studio cancelled the plans for the television series. The collapse of the franchise infrastructure, sequel, television series, and maintained sets all abandoned within weeks of the film's release was one of the most dramatic franchise cancellations of the era. The speed with which Universal retreated from its franchise plans reflected the severity of the commercial disappointment. The studio had invested not just in a single film but in an entire franchise ecosystem, and the first film's inability to generate sufficient commercial momentum made the entire ecosystem non viable overnight. Spin off Media Summers expanded the story of Van Helsing in two direct spin offs that were completed before the franchise's cancellation: the animated prequel Van Helsing, The London Assignment, which takes place before the main events of the film, and a one shot comic book published by Dark Horse Comics titled Van Helsing. From Beneath the Rue Morgue, which follows Van Helsing on a self contained adventure during the events of the film. Vivendi Universal Games published a Van Helsing video game for PlayStation 2, Xbox, and Game Boy Advance. The game follows a similar plot to the film, has gameplay similar to Devil May Cry, and the PS2 and Xbox versions feature the voice talent of many of the actors, including Hugh Jackman. Home media: The film was released on DVD and VHS in the fall of 2004, giving it a home media window during the holiday shopping season. The home media release included standard bonus features and behind the scenes content. Fools. The film's subsequent availability on Blu ray and streaming platforms extended its audience reach across the evolving home entertainment landscape of the following decade. Perception Box Office analysis: the film's worldwide total of $300. 2 million was commercially ambiguous, profitable in absolute terms, but disappointing relative to both the franchise expectations and the 170 million production budget. When marketing and distribution costs were factored in, the film's theatrical profitability was marginal at best, and the combination of modest domestic performance, 120 million, and solid but unspectacular international performance, 180 million, left the franchise without the commercial momentum needed to justify continuation. The domestic trajectory was particularly concerning. After the strong $51 million opening weekend, the film experienced a significant second weekend decline that indicated poor audience word of mouth. The cinema score B grade, a moderate audience response that signaled neither enthusiasm nor rejection, accurately predicted the film's inability to sustain attendance across multiple weekends. The final domestic gross of $120 million, while not disastrous, was substantially below what Universal needed from a $160 $170 million investment. The international performance of $180 million was the film's commercial strength, the monster characters' global recognition, and the visual spectacle's universal accessibility gave the film a broader international appeal than its domestic reception alone would have suggested. Hint. European markets, where the Gothic horror tradition had deeper cultural roots, were particularly responsive to the film's visual atmosphere and monster mythology. Critical response aggregate scores Van Helsing received mostly negative reviews from critics. Rotten Tomatoes, a review aggregator, reports that 24% of 224 surveyed critics gave the film a positive review. The average rating is 4.2810. The site's consensus calls the film a hollow creature feature that suffers from CGI overload. Metacritic rated it 35/100 based on 38 reviews. Audiences polled by CinemaScore gave the film an average grade of B on an A plus to F scale. The 24% Rotten Tomatoes score placed Van Helsing among the most negatively reviewed major studio releases of 2004. The Rotten Tomatoes consensus, hollow creature feature that suffers from CGI overload, captured the dominant critical complaint with precision. The film's reliance on digital spectacle at the expense of character development, narrative coherence, and emotional investment had produced something that was visually overwhelming but dramatically empty. The Metacritic score of 35 confirmed the professional critical community's strongly negative assessment. Excellent. The cinema score B, not a failing grade but well below the A range that sustains franchise commercial performance, indicated that even the audience predisposed to enjoy the film, those who chose to attend on opening weekend, found it only moderately satisfying. Selected negative reviews. James Berardinelli of Real Views gave an extremely negative review, rating the film half a star out of four and calling it the worst would be summer blockbuster since Battlefield Earth. Furthermore, he wrote, there are quite a few unintentionally funny moments, although the overall experience was too intensely painful for me to be able to advocate it as being so bad it's good. Some, however, will doubtless view it as such. More power to them, since sitting through this movie requires something more than a strong constitution and a capacity for self torture. Berardinelli's comparison to Battlefield Earth, one of the most notoriously reviled films of the early 2000s, was the critical record's most devastating assessment, placing the film in the company of what was widely considered the decade's worst major studio production. Bill Muller of the Arizona Republic gave it a rating of 2 out of 5, explaining that the film looks like a movie assembled by a room full of computer geeks munching Doritos and playing Wolfenstein in between stints of designing Dracula's fangs. Sweet. Muller's assessment targeted the film's apparent construction, the sense that digital effects work had been prioritized over dramatic craft, producing a film that functioned more as a technology demonstration than as a piece of storytelling. Bob Longino of the Atlanta Constitution gave the film a C minus, describing it as stuffed with enough over the top computer effects to choke George Lucas. The George Lucas comparison, suggesting that even the filmmaker most associated with CGI excess would find Van Helsing's digital effects density overwhelming, captured the critical perception of a film that had passed the saturation point for computer generated spectacle. Mick Lasalo of the San Francisco Chronicle provided one of the most comprehensively negative assessments. Writer director Stephen Sommers throws together plot strains from various horror movies and stories and tries to muscle things along with flash and dazzle, but his film just lies there, weighted down by a complete lack of wit, artfulness, and internal logic. What Summers tries to do here is use action as the only means of involving an audience, so the story is sacrificed. Character development is non existent, and there are no attempts to incite emotion. Instead, Somers tries to hold an audience for 2 hours with nothing up his sleeve but colored ribbons, bright sparklers, and a kazoo. What he proves is that there is no way to make movies. Lassalle's review was the critical record's most analytically devastating assessment. His argument that Somers attempted to sustain audience engagement through action alone, sacrificing every other element of filmmaking, identified the specific formula that the critical community found unacceptable. The metaphor of colored ribbons, bright sparklers, and a kazoo captured the perception that the film's spectacle was not merely excessive but fundamentally insubstantial, decorative rather than meaningful, distracting rather than engaging. Roger Ebert, the positive dissent Roger Ebert of the Chicago Sun-Times, gave the film 3 stars out of 4, stating that at the outset, we may fear Summers is simply going for FX overkill, but by the end, he has somehow succeeded in assembling all his monsters and plot threads into a high voltage climax. Van Helsing is silly, spectacular, and fun. Ebert's 3 star review was the most prominent positive critical assessment and the one most frequently cited by the film's defenders. His willingness to engage with the film on its own terms as silly, spectacular, and fun rather than as a failed attempt at something more serious represented a critical position that acknowledged the film's genuine entertainment value without claiming it achieved anything beyond that entertainment. The phrase silly, spectacular, and fun was both a recommendation and a limitation, describing a film that delivered pleasures that the majority of critics did not consider sufficient to compensate for the narrative and character deficiencies they had identified. Ebert's observation that Summers somehow succeeded in assembling all his monsters and plot threads into a high voltage climax credited the film's structural achievement, the ability to converge its multiple monster storylines into a coherent final act while implicitly acknowledging that the journey to that climax was less controlled than the destination itself. Awards mixed recognition. The film's awards record reflected its polarized reception, recognition in technical and genre categories alongside nominations at bad film ceremonies. At the Saturn Awards, the film was nominated for Best Horror Film, Best Costume Design, Gabriella Pescucci, Carlo Poggioli, Best Makeup, Greg Cannom, Steve Laporte, and Best Special Effects Scott Squires, Ben Snow, Daniel Jennings, Sid Dutton, Alan Silvestri won the Saturn Award for Best Music. The Saturn win for Silvestri was the film's most significant competitive award victory, acknowledging the genuine quality of the orchestral score regardless of the critical assessment of the film it accompanied. At the Teen Choice Awards, the film received nominations for Choice Action Movie, Choice Thriller Movie, Drama, Action, Adventure, Hugh Jackman, Choice Movie Actress. Drama, Action, Adventure, Kate Beckinsale, and Choice Movie Fight Action Sequence, Hugh Jackman versus Richard Roxburgh. The Visual Effects Society nominated Jeff Heron and Chad Taylor for outstanding special effects in service to visual effects in a motion picture at the Stinker's Bad Movie Awards. The film was nominated for Worst Film, Worst Actress, Kate Beckinsale, and Worst Female Fake Accent, Beckinsale, with Richard Roxburgh winning Worst Male Fake Accent. The simultaneous Saturn Award nominations, Genre Excellence, and Stinker's nominations, Worst Film, encapsulate the film's reception paradox. A production whose technical craft in specific departments was genuinely distinguished, deployed in service of a film that the broader critical community found fundamentally unsuccessful. The reboot and legacy, the film's legacy extends beyond its own critical and commercial reception into its influence on Universal's subsequent monster franchise strategies. In May 2012, Universal Pictures announced a reboot of the film with Alex Kurtzman and Roberto Orci to produce a modern reimagining and Tom Cruise to star as the title character. The reboot went through multiple development phases before Cruise left the Van Helsing project to star in Kurtzman's The Mummy 2017 instead. Following the poor critical and financial reception to that film, Universal restructured their plan for rebooted adaptations of their classic monsters to be standalone in nature, a strategic pivot that produced the critically acclaimed The Invisible Man 2020 and Wolfman 2025. By December 2020, the reboot was back in development. Julius Avery was hired as director in addition to doing a rewrite of an original script by Eric Pearson. James Swan was attached to serve as producer. The ongoing reboot development, more than 2 decades after the original film and more than 16 years after its franchise ambitions were abandoned, demonstrates the enduring appeal of the Van Helsing concept even after the 2004 film's commercial disappointment. The character's fundamental proposition, a monster hunter who confronts the most fearsome creatures in Gothic horror, remains commercially attractive regardless of any individual film's execution of that premise. The 2004 Van Helsing's lasting significance lies not in its own critical or commercial achievement but in its role within the larger story of Universal's monster franchise ambitions. It was the first major attempt after the Mummy films to build a shared cinematic universe from Universal's classic monster properties. Its commercial disappointment delayed but did not abandon that ambition, which would resurface as the Dark Universe concept in 2017, launched and immediately destroyed by the Mummy's failure before finally finding sustainable form in the standalone horror approach that produced The Invisible Man's critical and commercial success. The film itself, silly, spectacular, and fun in Ebert's generous assessment, a hollow creature feature in the Rotten Tomatoes consensus, remains a specific artifact of a specific moment in Hollywood franchise strategy. The era between The Lord of the Rings and the MCU, when studios believed that the key to franchise success was spectacle at maximum volume. What the MCU would subsequently demonstrate that character, humor, and emotional investment were more important than visual scale was the lesson that Van Helsing's commercial disappointment had been teaching all along, if anyone at Universal had been willing to learn it. Crossover movies have a nasty history in the movie world. Some movie exec gets the notion, hey, why can't two great tastes taste great together? But what we are left with is usually uninspired. The Flintstones meet the Jetsons notwithstanding. Crossovers for horror movies are the worst of the lot. For every Freddy versus Jason, there's a dud, like 1966's Jesse James meets Frankenstein's daughter. That year went down in the annals of cinematic history, however, as it also gave us Billy the Kid versus Dracula, marking two entries in the expanding genre of cowboys battling famous monsters. As far as I know, this genre still stands at two movies. So, what can one expect from Van Helsing? A big budget creature feature that includes Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Wolfman. Van Helsing, Hugh Jackman, and a really big hat is a secret soldier for a covert order of the Vatican. This covert order dispatches monsters and creepy crawlies the world over. He's been ordered to assist Anna Valerius, Kate Beckinsale, the last, in a Romanian family line that has sought to kill the infamous Dracula, Richard Roxburgh. It seems that their family line is dwindling, and Anna's brother being turned into a werewolf doesn't help the situation. If her family line dies before Dracula, then they cannot enter heaven. Van Helsing comes to town to help out the locals who are terrorized by Dracula's flying brides. Van Helsing effectively kills one of the vamp ladies and is celebrated as a hero by the village. As he gets closer to Anna, he also learns more about his own mysterious past and his connection to a certain figure with big teeth. The Big D has a dastardly plan. He wants to find Frankenstein's monster, Schuler Hensley, to channel enough power through him to awaken zillions of goosacks harboring the vamp's undead brood. Of course, Frankenstein's monster isn't too keen on this. Together, he and Van Helsing, with the help of Anna as well as a comic relief monk, battle to stop Dracula from unleashing his children of the night. Van Helsing is stupid, stupid, stupid. Director Stephen Sommers exists in his own indulgent world where bigger is better and some CGI spackle will fix any plot holes. He makes check your brain at the door popcorn movies, but a popcorn movie is no excuse to forgive a rambling, incoherent, loud, stupid mess. I liked the first Mummy flick and even found some good with the second, but Van Helsing is Summers at his rock bottom worst, gorging on a trough of special effects and vomiting the results onto the big screen. So, Summers' idea of character development is knocking people through walls like they were in a Looney Tunes cartoon. Van Helsing raises some interesting questions like why do Dracula's brides morph into flying demons that are conveniently genitalia free? Why does a werewolf rolling over the top of a carriage somehow cause it to catch on fire? Why does Dracula keep his magic lycanthropy cure in the open? It doesn't matter. Van Helsing is so straight laced about its absurdities that questioning them will just get tiresome. Not that you would expect much, but the acting in Van Helsing is bad. Beckinsale's accent couldn't be less convincing if her role were played by Charo. Swimsuit models play the trio of Dracula's brides, and let me just say their performance is on par with what you would expect from swimsuit models. Roxburgh is quite possibly the worst vampire in the modern history of vampires, and that includes Blackula, Count Chocula, and Tom Cruise. He couldn't look any less sinister if he was in a diaper and bonnet. What's up with those strands of hair that dangle in his face? Why do the Van Helsing creators want their Prince of Evil and Son of Satan to look like he was the keyboardist for some 80s pop synth band? This overly long film feels like a 7-year old's book report that he hasn't read. It's like a child is making this up as they go. And then a werewolf pops up, and then Dracula's flying brides, and then they all need Frankenstein's monster. Seriously, were they penning this script on the fly? It's a $150 million improv film. The reels of the film could be switched around and no one would be able to tell the difference. Van Helsing is one long, exasperated action sequence that drags its heels instead of wowing. It beats the audience into submission with its stupidity and redundancy. The entertainment level of Van Helsing is exceedingly weak. It runs an eternity which wouldn't be a problem if one were intrigued by the story, the characters, or the action sequences. The action could have been suitable, but Sommers has gotten less reliant on the physical and more superfluous with his CGI. Watching a CGI monstrosity smash into a CGI monstrosity before a CGI background where no semblance of reality is present grows tiresome after 130 minutes. The effects are passable, but they overload the viewer and numb whatever slight interest may have existed for the classic monsters. What should have been a clever homage turns instead into a hollow marketing ploy that's so frenetic and tireless with its manic pacing and bad special effects. Even the many attempts at humor are flat. It has to be some kind of apocalyptic sign that Hellboy and now Van Helsing have been unleashed unto the innocence of this world. Some will find Van Helsing decent popcorn entertainment, but most will grow weary of its sloppy design and wafer thin substance. For me, this is one to avoid, period. There isn't an ounce of fun to be had while sitting through the painful pair of hours that is Van Helsing. This is one monster mash that's a real monster mess needs grade. D. Writer, Reflections 20 Years Later in 2004. Van Helsing was being primed to be not just a blockbuster, but the forerunner for a new interconnected franchise, revitalizing the classic Universal horror icons. Director Stephen Sommers was hot off the success of the first two Mummy movies. Hugh Jackman had become a household name, playing everyone's favorite growling superhero, and Kate Beckinsale had proven her own box office, metal fighting vampires, and werewolves in the Underworld series. The studio was expecting so much that it planned a sequel, a TV series on NBC called Transylvania, an animated prequel, a clothing line, a video game, maybe even theme park editions, and to maintain the Eastern European sets so that they could be utilized for the eventual show and sequels. Obviously, this never came to pass, and Summer's last big Hollywood action movie was the 2009 G.I. Joe movie, and he hasn't directed a movie since 2013's Odd Thomas adaptation. He chose not to direct the third Mummy movie in 2008, but it seems like this man's career has never been the same since Van Helsing cratered in the summer of 2004. It began as the studio asking Sommers for even more monster movies, Summers pitching them all together as an Avengers style super movie, the studio getting carried away with larger plans of franchise dominance, and then when it didn't materialize, a promising popcorn filmmaker in the highest blockbuster sphere just vanished in a poof of overzealous CGI. In 2004, I did not like Van Helsing. That might be too charitable a description. I wrote in my original review, Van Helsing is stupid, stupid, stupid. Summers exists in his own indulgent world where bigger is better and some CGI speckle will fix any plot holes. He makes check your brain at the door popcorn movies, but a popcorn movie is no excuse to forgive a rambling, incoherent, loud, stupid mess. It was one of my worst movies of 2004, and 20 years later, I've mostly come around on the movie. I won't tell you that it's a great movie or even achieves that same magic alchemy of action adventure swashbuckle that the mummy brought back to major studio filmmaking in 1999, but Van Helsing is enjoyably ridiculous schlock nonsense. It was also one of my wife's favorite movies growing up, and she reminded me that her teenage self had a big crush on Richard Roxburgh's version of Dracula, not Hugh. I now view Van Helsing less as a horror monster action vehicle and more of a spy vehicle in a strange world. The titular Van Helsing is our secret agent complete with spy gadgets, with his comedic relief sidekick, and he's got his important missions and the sexy Bond girl, and the villains and betrayals, and added backstory that doesn't seem even necessary. It's Somers taking the structure of a spy thriller and supplanting it onto a Victorian era monster steampunk universe of demons and centuries old church conspiracies. Jackman is enjoyably suave as the Vatican's favorite killing machine, learning his own life lessons about the nature of legacy. I even enjoyed the villain's motivation for Dracula. He's trying to learn the secrets of Dr. Frankenstein's reanimation to ensure that his vampy babies survive. Here is a Dracula who is bereft because he cannot father living children. I suppose there could be further discussion over the different forms of life, as converting humans into vampires is itself a rebirth. Perhaps the distinction is like the difference between having biological children and adopted children. Maybe dear old Drac just wants to have a bundle of joy he can call his own. That's more interesting than versions that make him out to be some stalker ex boyfriend. Likewise, the role of Anna Beckinsale is given more pathos than simply being the strong Romani badass. While her wardrobe consists of corsets and teased hair to appeal to a young male demo, her character's mission is powerful and personal. Anna needs to kill Dracula not to save herself but to ensure the rest of her deceased family members can enter heaven. Talk about cumulative family guilt. That's heavy. When her face appears in the clouds at the end, like Mufasa, it's a confirmation of generational rest. That's an arc that's more fulfilling than being any love interest that would be discarded later. As soon as it got rolling, I said to my wife that this was going to go one of two ways. Van Helsing will learn that his organization is not as righteous as he believed them to be, manipulating him to eliminate threats to the organization's standing rather than threats to humanity. Or Dracula and Van Helsing have a personal connection that hasn't been fully examined. Dear reader, it went in both directions because Summers is slapping so many plot elements to make this movie feel full to bursting like a bloated tick. There's ideas stacked upon ideas here, references and unexplored plot points for an untapped universe. Vampires started werewolves. An hour in, all of Dracula's bats at AK, his children have been slain, and you may erroneously think the movie is over. Well, there's a whole other castle to explore with even more baby bats to kill. The last hour operates on pure video game mechanics of go here, grab this item, battle this mini boss. There's definitely a level of redundancy and more is more kitchen sink excess philosophy, but the bombast is part of his general appeal. There's a touch of Sam Raimi here, a touch of Michael Bay, schlock with sheen. Maybe it was my nostalgia goggles, or maybe I was just attuning to Sommer's wavelength. But the movie worked for me much better in 2024, as I was now charmed by its goofball sensibilities and less irritated by its overplotted script. You feel the admirable passion that Summers has for this universe, adopting stylish pastiches to celebrate the older movies and lore, but definitely bringing his more modern sensibilities to the forefront. There's a certain chaotic energy that animates Summers' big movies, bringing these classic characters together to run amok and crash into each other. That little kid's imagination, given the whole sandbox to play in, can be enviable and lively, and it can also lead into unexpected directions that unexpectedly go nowhere. The incorporation of Frankenstein's monster, Schuler Hensley, is more a plot device than a thoughtful character to bring to the team. He's the magical MacGuffin both sides are fighting to claim for their own. Van Helsing's major crime is trying too much and being too straight laced about it. It's not winking to the audience, it's not self commenting on its absurdities, it's just living them lavishly. In 2004, I couldn't appreciate that and this movie. And now I can find a place in my heart for such fun. My original review in 2004 is scathing with ready to blurb snark trying to convey the intensity of my distaste. The line that Somers is gorging on a trough of special effects and vomiting the results onto the big screen sticks with me. I'm surprised I restrained myself from making a Van Helsing sucks comment. Several of my criticisms about the acting, the confusing rules, and the convoluted storytelling are entirely valid. But they just don't bother me enough 20 years later. I can relax and enjoy the movie because it is a mess. That doesn't mean every flawed movie deserves kindly dismissing its faults if it doesn't aspire to anything other than mass entertainment. Big movies for big audiences can still be bad. I think Van Helsing's appeal is how sloppy it is and how excessive every element plays. In another universe, a dark universe, to borrow a phrase that came to me for no reason, this could have kicked off the interconnected Universal monster movies. Any reference to Egyptian mummies is absent, implying perhaps that Summer's earlier movies exist in a shared world. It was not to be, and Sumar's career has never been the same since, which is a real shame. The blockbuster space needs a filmmaker like Summers, a man nimble enough to juggle tones and childlike glee with darker humor. Come back, Stephen Summers, and maybe try your hand at the creature from the Black Lagoon while you're at it. A sci fi channel vampire serial overseen by provocateur, playwright, filmmaker Neil LaBute in the company of men. Who says life still can surprise you? Bigger shock. It's pretty good, or is at least, to quote that old critic, so better than it has any right to be. But what do rights or wrongs matter in the evocatively realized post apocalyptic near future conjured by Labute and his collaborators? The year is 2019, 3 years since a volcano exploded at Yellowstone, covering most of the west coast, if not the entire world, in sun obstructing ash. No natural light means that an underground nation of vampires, heretofore hidden from mankind, can now walk the earth, sucking blood at will and turning humans into fellow exsanguinators. The Labuti penned first part of the 2 hour premiere episode. That and an additional third hour were provided for review. Opens in media res, specifically at a Seattle hospital where a ragtag group of survivors hide from their toothy adversaries and a mystery woman, Kelly Overton, lies comatose. She's Vanessa Van Helsing, a character who is purportedly a descendant of Count Dracula's worst enemy, but who spends much of these early installments in varying states of confused terror after a ravenous vamp gives her a wake up call. Odds are good that by the finale of this 13 episode season, Vanessa will be giving Buffy Summers a run for her money in the roundhouse kick department. For now, she's mostly a bewildered enigma, especially to herself, though the second part of the premiere does reveal how she came to her current circumstances. It shouldn't be a shock that Vanessa's powers include the ability to reverse the vampiric process. One taste of her blood turns the monster back into man, though you are unlikely to find a more reluctant savior. She's much more interested in seeking out her long lost daughter, who was there when Vanessa slipped into her coma, and who is sure to feature more importantly in future episodes. For the moment, though, the action is primarily confined to the medical facility that steadfast military man, Axel, Jonathan Scarf, has decked out with booby traps and other Hellion slaying ephemera. You'd think this would lead to all manner of generic story beats, but La Butte and his writers, as well as stalwart TV director Michael Nankin, who does some truly terrific atmospheric work in these first three installments, managed to give the material a distinctive tweak or two. The first hour especially proceeds like one of Labuta's stage works, allowing a bunch of disparate personalities. One of them, a bloodsucker, Rukia Bernard, with whom Axel has a somewhat intimate relationship to bounce off of each other. The men are testosterone fueled, and the women do what they can to keep up with or counteract the machismo. Even in this genre heavy context, you can sense Labute doing his usual play on and prodding of gender stereotypes, habits that have earned him as much scorn as praise. However, there's something challenging about these tendencies here. The trashiness of the tale, along with the copious graphic gore, shades of the showrunner's own 2000 black comedy Nurse Betty, actually complements the standard love beautyisms and deepens them. The ensemble more than rises to the thematic challenges. Despite the tawdry trappings, Labute's concerns with manipulation, miscommunication, and abject cruelty and maybe, just maybe, a modicum of hope are well applied to a story of full societal breakdown. Stars Antonia Villens, Elspeth Foster, Beatrice Fletcher, Abby Casson Thompson, Daryl Griggs, Michael Hoad, written by Tom Joliffe, directed by Soner Meti, not to be confused with the Hugh Jackman film of the same name. This Van Helsing, originally titled Wrath of Van Helsing, is a British film from producer Scott Jeffrey and his Jagged Edge Productions, and regular readers of this site will know what that means. Four English lasses: Ellie, Antonia Villens, The Curse of Humpty Dumpty, The Legend of Jack and Jill, Briony, Elspeth Foster, Amityville Scarecrow 2, Alex, Beatrice Fletcher, Beneath the Surface, Blood in the Water, and Shauna, Abby Casson Thompson, Spider in the Attic, Exorcist Vengeance are going hiking. And where, you may ask, are they going hiking in fishnet stockings and thigh high boots? The Zone, which they must have thought was a goth club. Actually, it's a fenced off nuclear dumping ground, England's answer to Chernobyl. And not only is it fenced off, but there's also garlic on the road into it. So it's no surprise when they get attacked by hooded, neck biting creatures. Meanwhile, Ellie's parents are meeting with a man named, seriously, Igor Daryl Grigg's Reign of Chaos. Looks can kill. It seems she's gone missing and he knows this guy named Van Helsing. Michael Holt, the gardener, Hellcat, who can help? If this all sounds like utter crap, you're close to correct. Van Helsing is quite funny at times, but I'm not sure if that was intentional or not. I'd like to believe that writer Tom Joliffe, Jurassic Island, Witches of Amityville Academy, wasn't being serious when he came up with this mashup of nuclear waste and demons. And some of the dialogue certainly seems to be too absurd not to be a parody. Director Soner Metin, who was the second unit director on The Gardener, makes his directorial debut here, and he can't be blamed for all of Van Helsing's problems, such as underground tunnels with windows that let in bright sunlight. But he could have said something about the characters using their flashlights as they walk through them, or the demon mask that looks impressive until you realize you can see where it ends and the actor's neck begins. As for the film's titular hero, this version of Van Helsing has cut a deal with the devil for immortality so he can avenge the death of his family at the hands and fangs of a pack of vampires. Since they're supposed to be creatures of evil, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But this is a movie where underground tunnels have windows, while this Van Helsing has nothing in common with Peter Cushing's definitive version of the character. He does have something in common with Hugh Jackman's. They both use a crossbow, only Jackman has a steam powered one with fully automatic fire, and Hode has a mini one that you can buy for 20 bucks at the same flea market the demon's leather jacket came from. While it's certainly not a good film, Van Helsing is good for a few laughs, and it's not as deadly dull as the worst of Jeffrey's output, but it does suffer from the usual weak action scenes, and obviously plastic knives and swords that never seem to get blood on them as in his other films, with the exception of The Gardener. If you like your women on the hot topic goth side, or you and your buddies need something to rip apart over a few beers, Van Helsing might be worth your time. But there's really no other reason to waste your time or brain cells on it. Principal cast: Hugh Jackman, Kate Beckinsale, Richard Roxburgh, David Wenham, Shuler Hensley, Kevin J. O'Connor, Will Kemp, Elena, Alun Armstrong, Sylvia Coloca, Josie Maran, Tom Fisher, Samuel West, Stephen Fisher, Robbie Coltrane. Synopsis: the famed monster hunter is sent to Transylvania to stop Count Dracula, who is using Dr. Frankenstein's research and a werewolf for nefarious purposes. Okay, so there are good films, there are bad films, and then there are those that fall into a category all their own. Van Helsing, directed by Stephen Sommers, undoubtedly belongs to the latter group. With a runtime that feels almost as long as the centuries the titular character has been hunting monsters, this film promised a mix of action, horror, and adventure. Unfortunately, what it delivered was the chaotic cacophony of a terrible screenplay, inconsistent visual effects, and a complete inability to make the action exciting. The film kicks off with an action packed prologue as Van Helsing, Hugh Jackman, decked out in late 19th century attire, confronts Mr. Hyde in a seemingly never ending chase through the streets of Paris. The visual effects are immediately questionable as Hyde's transformation from the hulking brute to his human form lacks the sophistication one would expect from a big budget production. As the sequence unfolds, it's clear that the CGI is a mixed bag, a foreshadowing of what's to come. Van Helsing, a legendary monster hunter working for the Vatican, is tasked with eliminating the notorious Count Dracula. Richard Roxburgh, a resourceful yet inexplicably coy friar named Carl David Wenham, joins him. The pair arrives in Transylvania, a place that seems to have an identity crisis, with a landscape that oscillates between dark Gothic villages and sweeping, bright green landscapes that feel like they've been lifted from an entirely different movie. Once in Transylvania, Van Helsing encounters Anna Valerius, Kate Beckinsale, the last surviving member of a noble family committed to ridding the land of Dracula and his brood of monsters. It's here that the plot takes a convoluted turn as Van Helsing and Anna embark on a quest to kill Dracula, end a curse on her family, and uncover their own mysterious pasts. But rather than diving deep into character development or world building, the film opts for a disjointed, incoherent narrative that's more concerned with CGI infused action sequences than with storytelling. The plot becomes even more befuddling with the introduction of Dr. Frankenstein, Schuller Hensley, whose monster is being used by Dracula to bring his offspring to life. Yes, you read that correctly. Dracula is now an evil scientist too. The storyline barrels forward with reckless abandon, juggling werewolves, vampires, and an assortment of other creatures, leaving the audience feeling as if they've been thrust into a cinematic blender. As the film barrels towards its climax, the viewer is subjected to a muddled mess of climactic battles, none of which provide the emotional payoff they ought to. The film's resolution is not only unsatisfying but also remarkably underwhelming, leaving the viewer with a sense of confusion and disappointment. One of the most anticipated aspects of Van Helsing was the promise of visual effects. Unfortunately, the film's visual effects can be likened to a bumpy ride on a ghost train, full of jumps, scares, and jolts, but ultimately failing to impress. From the very first scene, It's clear that the film relies heavily on CGI, but the execution often falls flat. The transformation of Mr. Hyde is an early indicator of the film's shortcomings in this department. Rather than a seamless blend of practical effects and CGI, Hyde's transformation looks more like an awkward and jarring computer generated transition. This is an issue that plagues many of the creature effects throughout the movie. The werewolves in Van Helsing are a case in point. Rather than appearing as menacing and terrifying creatures, they often look like computer generated cartoons with the gravity defying movements of action figures. The disconnect between the CGI and the live action elements of the film is glaring, constantly reminding the audience that they are watching a work of fiction. On the other hand, some of the practical effects, such as the sets and costumes, are impressive. The Gothic architecture of Dracula's castle and the detailed period costumes are visually stunning and add a touch of authenticity to the film. However, these elements are overshadowed by the over reliance on CGI, which detracts from the film's overall aesthetic. Inconsistent character designs also contribute to the visual chaos of Van Helsing. Dracula, played by Richard Roxburgh, is given an odd and uninspiring makeover, coming across more as a dandy villain in a period drama than the formidable vampire lord he's supposed to be. The film attempts to introduce a new take on classic monsters like Dracula and Frankenstein's monster, but fails to make them memorable or visually compelling. The plot of Van Helsing is an exercise in narrative confusion and cliche overload. Rather than crafting a well thought out and engaging story, the film seems to have thrown in every horror and adventure trope available and hoped for the best. The film's central premise is convoluted and struggles to maintain a sense of coherence. It introduces a multitude of subplots, including the curse on Anna's family, Dracula's quest to use Frankenstein's monster to create offspring, and Van Helsing's mysterious past. With so many elements in play, the film lacks focus and depth, leaving viewers with a shallow and unsatisfying narrative experience. In an attempt to infuse the story with emotional weight, the film explores the relationship between Van Helsing and Anna. However, their interactions are often undermined by clunky dialogue and a lack of genuine chemistry. It's challenging to invest in their budding romance when it feels forced and unconvincing. The film's treatment of classic monsters is equally disappointing. Dracula, the iconic vampire, is reduced to a one-dimensional, snobbish villain with little depth or charisma. Similarly, Frankenstein's monster is used as a convenient plot device rather than a character with a meaningful role in the story. These iconic monsters deserve more respect and creativity than they are given in Van Helsing. The film's attempts to add layers to Van Helsing's character, particularly regarding his mysterious past, fall flat due to a lack of sufficient exploration and development. The audience is left with a protagonist who is more of a two dimensional action hero than a complex and intriguing character. The incoherent plot and inconsistent character development ultimately make Van Helsing feel like a missed opportunity. With such a rich source material to draw from, the film could have offered a fresh take on classics, horror tropes, and adventure. Instead, it relies on tired cliches and fails to deliver a compelling story. One of the most glaring flaws in Van Helsing is its screenplay. The dialogue is riddled with cliches, cringeworthy one liners, and forced attempts at humor that fall flat. Rather than enhancing character development or advancing the plot, the script often detracts from the viewer's immersion in the story. Carl, the friar, is the main source of comic relief, but his humor often feels out of place and forced. The film's tone constantly shifts between campy and serious, leaving the audience unsure of how to react to the dialogue. This inconsistency in tone makes it difficult for the viewer to connect with the characters or the story. In addition to the problematic humor, Van Helsing is filled with cringeworthy lines that are better suited to a B movie rather than a big budget production. Lines like, I have no idea what's going on, or I've never done this before, are absolutely meaningless and do little to engage the audience or create a sense of tension or excitement. The film script also fails to provide meaningful character development or depth. Characters often rely on expositional dialogue to convey their backstories or motivations rather than allowing these aspects to emerge organically through the narrative. As a result, the characters feel one dimensional and underdeveloped. Despite a desperate desire to make the action exciting, director Stephen Sommers' approach to the film's action sequences falls flat. With a background in action adventure films such as the Mummy franchise, one would expect Sommers to deliver thrilling set pieces. Unfortunately, Van Helsing is filled with underwhelming and disjointed action scenes. The film's action sequences suffer from a lack of clarity and coherence. It's often challenging to follow the movements of the characters and the creatures they're fighting, as the camera work and editing create a chaotic and disorienting experience. The over reliance on CGI further detracts from the physicality and impact of the action, making it difficult to invest in the stakes of the battles. The film's climactic battles, which should have been the highlight of the movie, are marred by a sense of spectacle over substance. Rather than building tension and excitement, these sequences are overwhelmed by the frenetic use of CGI and an excess of explosions and special effects. It's as if the film is trying to compensate for its lack of storytelling and character development with bombastic action, but it only exacerbates the film's shortcomings. The lack of practical effects and choreography in the action scenes robs them of the physicality and realism that could have made them engaging. The overuse of wire work and CGI acrobatics creates a sense of weightlessness, detracting from the impact of the fights. In the realm of Dracula themed movies, Van Helsing pales in comparison to previous adaptations. While the character of Van Helsing has appeared in numerous films and series over the years, the film's depiction of him deviates significantly from his literary origins. In Bram Stoker's Dracula, Professor Abraham van Helsing is a brilliant and resourceful Dutch doctor with a deep knowledge of obscure diseases and a steadfast determination to rid the world of Count Dracula. He is a complex character, blending intelligence with a deep sense of duty and morality. This portrayal of Van Helsing has been a hallmark of the character, emphasizing his intellect, courage, and unwavering commitment to defeating the vampire. Van Helsing, on the other hand, turns Van Helsing into an action hero with a mysterious past. While Hugh Jackman brings charisma to the role, the character lacks the depth and intelligence that have defined Van Helsing in the original novel and many classic adaptations. The film sacrifices character development for over the top action sequences, leaving the character of Van Helsing feeling one dimensional. When it comes to previous Dracula themed films, there have been iconic portrayals of the vampire lord and his adversaries. Films like Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula and F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu have presented nuanced and memorable versions of Dracula. These films captured the essence of the vampire as a seductive and enigmatic antagonist. In contrast, Van Helsing reduces Dracula to a one dimensional villain who lacks the sophistication and allure of previous interpretations. The film's attempts to make Dracula an evil scientist and a menacing vampire lord fall short, robbing the character of the complexity that has made him an enduring literary and cinematic figure. While the film may have found a niche audience who enjoy campy, over the top action and are willing to overlook its numerous flaws, it remains a missed opportunity to breathe new life into the world of classic monsters. With its convoluted plot, underdeveloped characters, and lackluster action, Van Helsing is a misstep in the annals of horror cinema, one that leaves audiences yearning for a more satisfying and engaging monster hunting experience. Rodney has been writing about films for well over 2 decades, appreciates a good wine, the love of his wife and kids, and the affection of his dog and cats. He has a fondness of cheesy 90s action and classic Hollywood, hates that physical media is disappearing, and wishes somebody would make a high budget series of the never ending story. I went into Van Helsing not expecting much with the mixed to negative reviews, but I was somewhat curious about it. It's not really a good movie, however, I did enjoy parts of it. There's an element of campiness to the movie that helps to make it occasionally entertaining. However, it's just not enough to sustain the film. The script at its center is rather generic and isn't anything special, with a thin and dull plot, and doesn't even do much with the setting or the classic Universal monsters, characters, and aspects. It's also pretty long at around 2 hours and 10 minutes and was badly paced across this runtime. Van Helsing has a good cast, but most of the actors aren't utilized the best. I like Hugh Jackman and Kate Beckinsale, but this is far from their best work. They are stuck working with generic writing and end up delivering dull performances. Some actors get to ham it up, however. David Wenham delivers the comic relief as Van Helsing's sidekick. The highlight of the cast is Richard Roxburgh, who plays Dracula. While he's not the best portrayal of the character by any means, he is actually allowed to embrace the camp and cheesiness. He chews the scenery in such an enjoyable way and works for this movie's take on the character. Stephen Sommers clearly knows how to make a blockbuster when looking at his mummy movies. Unfortunately, Van Helsing isn't on the level of either of those, even if it does have some appealing elements. I liked the gothic aesthetic, which is clearly inspired by Universal monsters. There is some solid production design with castles and laboratories, and occasionally some good practical effects. The over the top action sequences are also fun to watch. However, it really is held back by the ridiculously awful effects, with the CGI monsters looking cartoonish and ruining any kind of horror elements they were going for. Somehow, they feel more glaringly aged than anything in the Mummy movies made years earlier. Van Helsing is a really dated, overlong, and goofy flick that's occasionally fun with some over the top action and hammy performances. Someday the mountain might get him, but the law never will. Van Helsing, 2004, 7 out of 10. The titular Van Helsing finds himself sent on a mission to Transylvania to hunt Dracula and prevent a family of gypsies from being trapped in purgatory. Van Helsing is a huge film that is, at times, overstuffed with action, cliffhangers, and cameos. It has Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, a werewolf, Dracula's brides, Dracula's babies, Dracula's Oompa Loompas, other vampires, other werewolves, gypsies with torches, Victor Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, Van Helsing, Igor, and Kate Beckinsale. Van Helsing is overall a fun time that is appropriate monster mayhem for the whole family. The film suffers from some teensy tiny flaws that take it down a notch from writer director Steven Sommers' previous Mummy films. But like that very thin mint fed to Mr. Creosote in the meaning of life, any of these could cause the entire experience to explode. What follows is a non comprehensive list of teeny tiny Van Helsing issues. Our Dracula is kind of, well, lame. Richard Roxburgh's take on the Count does eventually grow on one with his tongue firmly planted in cheek. After all, this is as much his movie as it is Van Helsing's. One wonders what the film could have done with Gary Oldman or even Tom Cruise in the role. Roxburgh doesn't have enough menace, and he seems more of a put upon husband with three wives than an actual bad guy. There is a special effects failure from which the movie has trouble recovering. About two-thirds of the way through the movie, Van Helsing jumps a chasm with a carriage pulled by four horses. A vast chasm. You know, the bridge is our kind of thing. The type of chasm that General Lee would balk at jumping. It is ridiculous on paper and looks even worse on screen. Cassiti. In fact, the whole movie seems to have a problem with physics. No one seems to have mass, and even to allow that Van Helsing, Dracula, and the werewolves are indestructible, it doesn't explain why Kate Beckinsale isn't dead like 30 times from falls alone. The movie also has a problem keeping itself grounded. Transylvania seems to have nothing but sheer cliffs, and the moon is full every 3 days. Everything is a cliffhanger, and the film never takes a moment to breathe in its over 2 hours running time lest it not be able to fit in one more space, cliffhanger, or character reveal. There is more good than bad overall, however, with various characterizations such as Dracula's brides and Frankenstein being particular standouts. And while one can nitpick for days, why exactly does Dracula even want children? A fun time is in store from a live action cartoon point of view. And now for something completely different. Since this is an overstuffed movie, why not an overstuffed review? First of all, I know that video game adaptations were box office poison in 2004 and not much better now, but yes, the makers of Van Helsing had to realize at some point they were making an almost perfect Castlevania movie. Change Kate Beckinsale's last name from Valerius to Belmont and change nothing else, and one does have a scene for scene recreation of Castlevania. Whilst I had stuck with Van Helsing from season 1, finding it entertaining even if it wasn't high drama, I was less impressed with season 4 than the preceding seasons. For completeness, you can also read the reviews of season 2 and season 3. Because of this, I did not run headfirst into season 5 when it dropped to Netflix. It was something I knew I should rectify, but I procrastinated. And then I noticed that a box set of all 5 seasons on Blu ray was being released. I picked it up and then did a serious binge session, rewatching the first 4 seasons before hitting season 5. So, the first thing to report was that I enjoyed the revisit, and whilst I stand by my comments with regards season 4, it did hold up better, probably because the new characters felt more familiar, and also because the lack of a distinct season arc meant less when you were immediately jumping into season 5. So we were left at the end of season 4 with apparently immortal heroes Julius, Alex Paunovic, Chupacabra V's The Alamo and Dirk Chenley's Holistic Detective Agency, and Axel Jonathan Scarf mysteriously dying outside the bunker to a military research lab. Vanessa Van Heeling, Kelly Overton. True Blood was stuck in the dark realm, as was her scientifically created daughter Jack, Nicole Munoz, also Chupacabra V's The Alamo, Sanctuary, and Hemlock Grove. The Dark One, Dracula, Trisha Helfer, had escaped the dark realm in Jack's form, killed the president, Jill Teed, and taken her form, and Jack's sister Violet, Kia King, failed to kill her as she escaped in a helicopter. The season, mostly, then follows the path of getting to Dracula, However, the first few episodes see Vanessa opening a portal in the dark realm that allows Jack to escape, but into the past. She appears in Transylvania. We won't tackle the fact that she could understand the locals and vice versa. In the previous episode, she was psychically given the ability to read an obscure language. So perhaps it's a knock on effect at the point where the local Count Kim quotes Dracula the series, red blooded American girl, Innocent Blood and the Dresden Files, and his bride Olivia, Tricia Helfer, have just had almost miraculously a child, and that their familial name is Dracula. This is Dracula's origin story, and we discover that Olivia is to be used as a vessel for the Dark One, a malevolent spirit, and whilst not the source of vampirism, this could be said to be vampiric possession. Jack does do things that change the present to a degree, mostly making Dracula weaker. It was nice that the exterior shots used Orava Castle back to the present, and we discover that Washington, D.C. is a safe zone. Whether the TV broadcasts from the previous season were to be there only or to more unaffected regions, beyond the walls around DC, it is still the vampire apocalypse is unclear. Challenges. The series knows it was the last season, and for those characters still standing, it does its best to bring conclusions to each story and is successful in this. Though don't expect each story to have a happy ending. It's a mixed bag, and rightly so. The episode stories all work towards that end or the conclusion of the season proper, though there is one flashback moment where the wig Alex Paunovic was forced to wear should have been sense checked. What I did notice was the pandemic awareness it brought to the construct, a chemical released by the government to kill vampires, which causes chemical storms as deadly to humans as vampires and causing powerful mutations in some vampires cause the need to wear masks. There is also reference to fake news. The 45th president, Davis Park, Stephen Lobo, was turned, presumed dead, but is found and turned back to human in an episode where MAGA caps are being sold in a scavenger store. This leads to the need to restore his presidency, and of course, the 46th president is a shape shifting imposter. This didn't feel pro Trump or Biden, just a mismatch without a sought out political narrative. Not all were welcome. Vanessa is brought back in episode 9, but I could have lived without the majority of the episode, which was essentially just a clip showing Vanessa's past triumphs and failures as she learns, I guess. It felt positively filler. The character needed to return, but it could have happened in a scene, not an episode, and was simply bad TV. Being fair, it probably felt even worse having binged the episodes it came from over the previous week and a half. Jack and Violet felt better constructed as the series had time to develop them, which was to the benefit of the show. All in all, more enjoyable than season 4 and a fitting conclusion to the series. 6 out of 10. Sequels and franchises, whether we like it or not, are an essential part of the Hollywood machine. They have been ever since 1916 when director Thomas Dixon unleashed The Fall of a Nation, a follow up to his seminal Silent, The Birth of a Nation. A shared cinematic universe is also nothing new, despite Marvel and Tolkien adaptations bringing them increasingly to our attention. The first, and in many opinions, finest, communal chronicles were launched in the early 1930s, complements of Universal's classic monster movies. Horror fans of any vintage go misty eyed at any mention of James Whale's brace of Frankenflicks, Todd Browning's Trip to Transylvania, or George Wagner's Full Moon Fever. And each of these launched multiple follow ups, keeping the likes of Lon Chaney, Boris Karloff, Bela Lugosi, and Glenn Strange in gainful employment for many years. It was the Monsters Rally flicks that united all these beloved beasties, such as 1943's Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman and 1944's House Half of Frankenstein, that really put them on the map, however. These sequels may not have been groundbreaking genre landmarks like the originals that spawned them, but lordy were they a lot of fun. The raft of reboots produced by Hammer Studios throughout the 1950s and 1960s provided plenty of thrills and spills, but kept the paranormal protagonists apart. While Stephen Sommers breathed new life into the genre with his take on The Mummy in 1999, Cards on the Table Time, this scribe thought The Mummy was great, packed with action, lovable heroes, a suitably spooky but sympathetic adversary, and a jet propelled script. It was the perfect way to bring the classic gallery of monsters back to their rightful place at the top of the terror tree in a post slasher age where screenchills seemed destined to carry a PG 13 certificate. The sequel, The Mummy Returns, was a CGI saturated misstep, but that didn't deter excitement about Sommer's next project, as Van Helsing looked like catnip on paper for fans of fright fused fantasy. Hugh Jackman battling Dracula, the Wolfman, and Frankenstein's monster in some kind of festival of fiends reunited. It would surely be glorious. It wasn't. Instead of the ultimate supernatural smackdown it promised, Van Helsing is a messy, tiresome slog that acts as a precautionary tale for filmmakers everywhere. Sommers throws effects at the screen with all the restraint of a toddler that discovers a secret stash of Haribo, and the migraine inducing result feels like a bad acid trip through the mind of Uwe Boll. Despite this, probably the worst thing about Van Helsing is that it contains moments of genuine greatness. The opening sequence is everything that classic horror nuts hoped and dreamed it would be: gloriously large scale monochrome mayhem featuring Victor Frankenstein, his creature, Richard Roxburgh having a lovely time re-rolling his as a hugely arch Dracula, Kevin O'Connor bringing sleazy life to Igor, and more panicked pitchfork waving villager extras than a UKIP convention. It's a universal monster movie on a millennial budget, and it's beautiful. Unfortunately, that's pretty much as good as it gets. From the moment we meet Jackman's take on Gabriel Van Helsing, a descendant of the legendary vampire slayer made famous by Edward Van Sloan and Peter Cushing, it becomes pretty clear that the jig is up. Full credit to Summers for embodying his titular monster slayer with shades of moral grey as opposed to outright heroism. But his opening battle with Robbie Coltrane's Edward Hyde is so overstuffed with needless CGI that it feels like substandard cutscene from a Castlevania video game. That's a theme that endures throughout the movie. For every pulse pounding and enjoyable action set piece, such as the death from above wrought upon Transylvania by Dracula's glamorous brides, there's a tiresome batch of pixels chasing each other around the increasingly crowded screen. Michael Bay doesn't make monster movies, but if he did, ordinarily the charisma of Hugh Jackman in the lead role would be enough to make up for this, but Van Helsing has to rank as one of the weakest showings of his career. The Antipodean action man's delivery is bizarrely stiff and stoic throughout, quite possibly embarrassed by some of the dialogue assigned to him, while his nominal romantic interest, Kate Beckinsale, simply ticks items off the ass kicking female lead checkbox while stifling yawns. The monsters are also wasted. Aside from Roxburgh's camp count, Schuler Hensley's creature gets plenty of screen time and plot emphasis, but whimpers through his dialogue like he has a mouthful of soggy tissue. And the emotional impact of Will Kemp's lycanthropic curse is stunted by the shoddiness of the setup. These are minor issues compared to David Wenham's Q-esque simpering sidekick. However, who must rank as the most irritating attempt at light relief since Rob Schneider's Tank Out Megacity 1. Venom's Carl is fed one-liners at a rate of knots, and each one drives a further stake into the heart of the audience's interest. Somers proved that he can write sharp, sparky dialogue with the mummy and the superb sea monster smash Deep Rising. And he recently returned to form with his Dean Koontz adaptation, Art Domus. So, what happened here? Presumably, it was the writer director's familiar Achilles heel that seems to raise its head whenever he is handed a substantial budget. A determination to prioritize pyrotechnics over plot, and an unhealthy obsession with CG that provides one of the most laughable endings in blockbuster cinema. The result ensures that instead of a cherished love letter to the movies that defined his childhood, Van Helsing is akin to watching a loop of Looney Tunes Halloween specials, Clockwork Orange style. Sadly, these classic critters have continued to be pushed through the mill ever since, with Joe Johnston's messy Wolfman remake, The Painfully Earnest Eye, Frankenstein, and Dracula Untold, making quite a hall of shame, although there is admittedly guilty pleasure to be derived from the latter. Thankfully, Universal plans to formally relaunch the Monster Universe with a fresh take on the mummy in the coming year, and hope springs eternal for these evergreen abominations. After all, legends never truly die.